All right. Week 7 is, as you'll notice, I'm sure, a very history heavy unit. And it's particularly heavy on British history. So, what I wanted to do in this video is give you some orientation. There's going to be just a massive mound of material dropped on you. So, what I'd like to do is give you just a couple of threads to be paying attention to as you read. And then also, I want to say a little bit at the end about the English Civil War, which is in some ways the centerpiece of 17th century English history. I want to say a little bit about how it started and also about that name, English Civil War, and whether it's really adequate. Before you do anything else, go ahead and print out the handout 17th century England, the big picture. You can find that under the module in Canvas. Trust me, I think you're going to want to have that in front of you as you listen to this. One thing is for sure, the 17th century in England was a time of great turmoil and conflict and bloodshed. So the question is why, right? What were the English people fighting about? They're fighting about something. They must have failed to come to some sort of agreement about something. So what is that something, or what are those some things? Well, I think there are two major issues on which there was a total lack of consensus among the English people for most of the 17th century. One has to do with the form of government. What is the right form of government for England? What is the role of the king? What is the role of Parliament, which had been around for centuries? How were they to interact? Should there in fact be a king at all? Should Parliament really have much power at all? These questions were all open, live questions for the majority of the 17th century in England. The other major area of conflict was religion. So what I want to do is briefly talk about debates on the form of government and how that unfolded, and then debates about religion. And in both cases, there is some resolution that is achieved at the end of the century. Okay, form of government. Well, the English people had for centuries been very interested in the question, is the king above the law, or does the king have to submit himself to the law? If you know anything about the Magna Carta, one of the most important documents, political documents of all time, 1215, the Magna Carta stipulated that the king is in fact not above the law. But there were still questions that the Magna Carta didn't answer. So when we get to the beginning of the 17th century, I think we're going to see just how much disagreement there was over the question of the precise nature of royal authority. So we pick up our story with the reign of James I. It's the first name you'll see on this handout. Became king in 1603. He was the immediate successor of Elizabeth I. James I was very much a divine rights of king kind of guy. He believed that kings had the authority that they did because it was granted to them directly from God. And therefore it was absolute. It wasn't given to him by the people, it was given to him from above. Not only did he have strong feelings about this, but James actually wrote several treatises, several pamphlets on the subject. So he was really committed to this idea. And he wasn't just committed to this idea. If you look at the way he interacted or didn't interact with Parliament, you can see just how committed he was. He was quite aloof with respect to Parliament. At this time, there were no set requirements for how often Parliament had to meet. And as far as James was concerned, the less frequently, the better. And of course, he had a lot to do with that because at the time, only the king could convene Parliament. So that was a very convenient arrangement for James. When we come to his successor, Charles I, it's more of the same. Divine right of king. Charles tries to have very little to do with Parliament. In fact, he even outdoes James by dissolving Parliament in 1629 and then not calling it again for 12 years. That was an unprecedented hiatus in English history. Now, we'll learn, or you'll learn as you read in West in the World, that things don't end well for Charles. Let's just say that. Okay. After his death, and I'll give you a bit of a spoiler, he is executed as king. He is executed. And after his execution, we have this really radical political experiment instituted in England. The monarchy is abolished. So talk about, that's one way to answer the question, what's the relationship between the king and Parliament? There is no relationship because there should be no king. So for about 10 years, there is no king in England, although Oliver Cromwell, who is the head of this Commonwealth, which is often called the Puritan Republic, he eventually becomes kind of a military dictator, even though he didn't take the name king. But when he died in 1658, things really kind of fell apart. The English people were very ready for the reimposition of order and stability, and so the monarchy was restored in 1660. So it turns out just abolishing the monarchy is not actually going to solve the problem. So the monarchy comes back, and some things had changed. It was now a requirement that Parliament meet at least every 3 years. There was a bit more restraints on the royal power to tax. But the next two monarchies, the next two monarchs, the two kings of this restoration period, Charles II and then James II, again, these names, you can find them on here, they were both Stuarts, so they belonged to the same dynasty as James I and Charles I. And they very much thought like Stuarts. They would have loved to have been absolute rulers, unhampered by Parliament. But that's not exactly the way things worked out. And eventually, James II is basically driven from England. A Dutchman named William of Orange, comes over to England. He was married to James's daughter, Mary. And William and Mary, which of course is the namesake of the college in Virginia, William and Mary come over from the Netherlands in what is called the Glorious Revolution, or sometimes the Bloodless Revolution. Glorious because it was bloodless. There was no fighting, no battles, none of that. So William and Mary become the reigning monarchs of England. And the very next year, 1689, William passes the original Bill of Rights, which stipulates very clearly the kings are bound to the laws of the land, much more specifically, that the king cannot levy a new tax without the express permission or consent of Parliament. Parliament would henceforth meet on an annual basis, right? So very clear that even though the king obviously has a great deal of power, there are some pretty strict limits on those powers, and Parliament is there to enforce those limits. So what we can say is that by the end of the 17th century, what has triumphed in England is not absolute monarchy, it's not republicanism, but it's a constitutional monarchy. A monarchy that is chastened and held in check by a robust Parliament. So that's how the form of government question gets settled in the 17th century. Okay, But wrapped up with these forms of government questions are religious controversies. So much of the conflict and even violence of the 17th century in England was fueled, at least in part, by religious disagreements. Now we have to do a little background. We have to go back to the 16th century for a moment, to the reign of Elizabeth I, who very early in her reign passed the Act of Uniformity. You may remember reading about this a few weeks ago. The Act of Uniformity, 1559, required all English people to attend Church of England services. There was an official state church. That official state church was a Protestant church. It was a church that had severed its ties with the Roman Catholic Church. And so, legally speaking, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, was the only game in town. Okay? So that's 1559. Well, already there's going to be problems with this because certainly some Roman Catholics are going to convert to the Anglican Church, but many will not. So they exist in this kind of legal limbo where they don't really have legal rights, although they manage to find ways to continue to practice their faith. And even though Catholics were a minority, they were a significant minority. A minority that was often sort of despised by Protestant English people. But there's another group in the mix that's also going to create a great deal of religious agitation. And this is a group known as the Puritans. Now, originally, you were going to watch a lecture by me on the Puritans. Somebody fell asleep at the wheel and I guess didn't tape that lecture. So you're going to miss that. But it does require me now then to say a little bit about the Puritans so you know who they are and how they fit into the story. Who are the Puritans? Well, Puritans this is a homegrown English phenomenon. Okay, so when we talk about Puritans, we're really talking about either people who were in England or who were in New England. Puritanism as a movement emerged in the last several decades of the 16th century, so during Elizabeth's reign, and they were kind of a pain in the rear for Elizabeth. Who they were Anglicans, so they at least, sort of nominally belonged to the Church of England, but they weren't very happy about it. They found certain things about the Church of England highly dissatisfying, and this is where they get their name. But I should also mention that almost all Puritans embraced Calvinist theology. Let me mention that too. But here's what the name means. Puritans were so called because they wanted to purify the Church of England of all remaining vestiges of Roman Catholicism. They thought the Anglican Church was still too Catholic. Maybe in its theology in some ways, but especially in its worship and in its church organization. So let me just mention a couple of things that Puritans complained about, practices in the Church of England. The Church of England continued to carry on the practice of kneeling while you receive the Eucharist. And the Puritans didn't like that because they were good Calvinists. They didn't believe that Jesus was physically present in the bread and wine of the Eucharist, and they thought that kneeling in the Eucharist sent that message. So they were opposed to that practice. They were opposed to practices that really made strong distinctions between clergy, ministers, and lay people. So the fact that Anglican clergy continued to wear highly elaborate vestments, cloaks, stoles, headgear, all that, that was very off-putting to the Puritans. So those are the kinds of things that bothered them. And the rationale was not simply, well, if the Catholics do it, we shouldn't do it, although there was a bit of that in there. But there was a deeper principle. The deeper principle was that the church should not engage in practices that are not expressly based in Scripture. So any practice that is not doesn't find a clear warrant in Scripture ought to be rejected. And they took this very far. Okay, so among other things, the Puritans did not celebrate Christmas because, of course, Christmas is not a celebration that is endorsed in the New Testament. So they were willing to go quite far with this principle. Well, when Elizabeth died and James I became king, the Puritans were initially hopeful that James would really heed their pleas. After all, James was a Scot. He was actually a Calvinist in his theology, so they thought we might really get somewhere with this guy. Well, they got nowhere. James really just did not have any time for the Puritans either. He threw them one bone, which was he granted their request to sponsor a new translation of the Bible. And if you can't figure out what translation of the Bible I'm talking about, I'm just going to not tell you. So that's James. Charles, of course, is his successor. We've already mentioned Charles. And again, very much the same attitude towards the Puritans, really pretty contemptuous of the Puritans. So this is the time where we start seeing droves of Puritans leaving England, heading to New England. So this is actually a very important chapter in the history of the United States of America. But Charles did not just rankle Puritans. He also deeply offended other Anglicans by being entirely too comfortable with Catholicism. His wife was Catholic, and not only that, he allowed her to practice her faith in the court. So she was allowed to have Catholic clergy to come by, to say Mass and do all this. And of course, this is a bit of a problem, right? Because according to English law, that's illegal. And yet the king is allowing his wife to do this. All right. Well, fast forward to the death of Charles, the dawn of the so-called Puritan Republic. The Puritans really get their day in the sun. They get to make the laws. They get to enforce rest on the Sabbath, and they get to ban the theater and all these things they had been only dreaming of doing for decades. But again, this only lasts, a matter of years before it falls apart. And talk about a 180-degree reversal of fortune. When the monarchy is restored in 1660, Puritanism becomes illegal. If you preached Puritan ideas openly, you could go to jail. You're going to read about John Bunyan, the author of one of the most famous books of all time, The Pilgrim's Progress. He spent years in jail because he continued to be vocal in his Puritan views. All right. Does this mean then that the religious question is settled? Not at all, because now we again have Stuart monarchs on the throne, and the next two Stuart monarchs, Charles II and James II, are even more flirtatious with Catholicism than their predecessors. Charles II actually converts to Catholicism on his deathbed, but his son James II is already Catholic by the time he becomes king. Now, apparently, the English people initially hoped that maybe they could just weather one Catholic monarch and then, put a good Protestant back on the throne and everything would be okay. But the straw that broke the camel's back was that James's Catholic wife produced a male heir, right? So now you've got this male lineage, so it looks like the next king would be Catholic as well. That was just a bridge too far for Anglican English people. So this is when James is going to flee the throne in fear of his life, and William, who is married, as I said, to Mary, who was a Protestant daughter of James II, they come and take the throne. And one of the conditions, really, of taking the throne is affirming that from that point on, no Catholic or even spouse of a Catholic will ever sit in the English throne again. In the next year, around the year after the Glorious Revolution, 1689, this is the year of the Bill of Rights, which I've already mentioned. Another act is enacted, the Toleration Act. And this is really going to set English religious policy for decades and decades and decades to come. Why is it called the Toleration Act? Well, it's called the Toleration Act because it officially granted non-Anglican Protestants religious toleration. There are several groups like the Baptist and the Presbyterians. These were groups that separated themselves from the Anglican Church, but of course were Protestant. Prior to this point, they were basically underground churches. They're granted religious rights at this point, although they still could not hold political office. Catholicism was still not officially recognized, but in practice, it was tolerated. Okay? So from that point on, if you're Roman Catholic, you might, get some dirty looks, and you might face discrimination in certain ways, but no one's going to just stop you from practicing your faith. So, by the end of the 17th century, to a certain extent, the religious question is settled. England remains a defiantly Protestant nation. The Anglican Church is the dominant church in England, but England was a more tolerant place vis-a-vis Protestant non-Anglicans and Roman Catholics than it was at the beginning of the 17th century. Okay, got a few minutes left, so I promised earlier I'd say just a little bit about the English Civil War. I've mentioned it without really explaining what started it. And the first thing I actually want to say about this is that English Civil War, that phrase is a misnomer. Now, it's the Civil War part is not a misnomer because this was very much a civil war, much in the same way the 19th century American Civil War was a true civil war, i.e. you have, in some cases, brothers killing brothers. Okay, so it was a real civil war. But to call it the English Civil War is misleading because Scotland and Ireland were both intimately involved in this war. In fact, the war really gets started because of something that happens in Scotland and then something that happens in Ireland. In Scotland, there is a massive rebellion in 1640 because Charles I was trying to impose the Anglican Church on the Scots, and they didn't like it. And so some Scots invaded northern England in 1640. This was the crisis that was so acute that Charles actually had to convene Parliament for the first time in 12 years. Now, the Scots were eventually placated, but while Parliament was still in session, news came in from Ireland. And at this point, I need to do a little bit of background on Ireland, which we haven't said much about in this course so far. Since the late 12th century, English kings had been trying, with mixed success, to impose their will on Ireland. They saw Ireland as almost kind of a client or satellite state. But in the early 16th century, because of various uprisings in Ireland, English kings, the English monarchs, got real serious about sort of bringing Ireland into the domain, the royal domain of the King of England. So one of the things that the English will do is send over a bunch of settlers into Northern Ireland. Most of these settlers were Scottish, and most of those Scots were Presbyterian. okay, Calvinist Presbyterians. So they're sent to Northern Ireland. In many cases, they're colonizing that land. They're actively driving out the native Irish Catholic inhabitants. And the result is something that is still in some ways part of the contemporary Irish world. The result was a kind of cultural apartheid in Ireland. And in fact, many scholars have suggested that maybe apartheid is not the best analogy. Some scholars have suggested that the treatment of the Irish during this period is very similar in some ways to the treatment of Native Americans in this country during the colonial period and beyond. All right, let's bring us back up to speed in the story. So we've had the colonization, largely Protestant colonization of Northern Ireland going on for decades. Well, in 1641, there is an uprising. It's called the Ulster Rising. Ulster, U-L-S-T-E-R. Ulster is sort of the name for Northern Ireland. And these Irish who were involved in the uprising massacred a number of Protestant settlers. And the English began sort of hyperventilating about this immediately, paranoid that this was going to be the beginning of a full-scale Catholic rebellion, that the Irish might invade England and make it Catholic, and we've got to nip this thing in the bud. We can't have that happen. And virtually everyone, at least Protestants in England, agree, okay, the Irish need to be subdued, but who's going to do that? Can we really trust Charles's army to subdue the Irish? Because Charles seems to be a little too friendly with Roman Catholics. Remember, he's married to a Catholic woman. And so there's debate about this. This is what begins the Civil War, because Parliament says, you know what, we're going to raise our own army and we're going to take care of the Irish. At that point, we have the rise of two separate armies in England, one fighting on behalf of the king, one fighting on behalf of Parliament. Now, after parliamentary forces secure a victory in England, they turn their attention back to Ireland, and there's some really brutal massacres perpetrated by parliamentary forces against the native Irish Catholic inhabitants. Catholics in Ireland lost their land. The Catholic clergy were considered enemies of the state, and so on. So there's this massive kind of crackdown in Ireland. And so by 1650, one can say that really for the first time in history, Scotland and Ireland, both Scotland and Ireland, were firmly under the thumb of the English monarch. So you can see why English Civil War doesn't quite work, because the Scottish and Irish dimensions of the war are terribly important. And if you look at the body count, which is quite depressing, you can see this too. By 1660, by the restoration of the monarchy, there have been 250,000 deaths in Scotland and England and Wales, and about 200,000 dead in Ireland. That's 1/10 of the population of the British Isles dead as a result of these wars. So we can continue to call it the English Civil War. I mean, that's fine because people still call it that. I just want you to see that a better name would probably be something like the British Civil Wars or the Irish-British Civil Wars. Okay, I'm right under that 30-minute mark, so I'm checking out.